Before we begin, true skepticism does not begin by being anti-anything. The process of open consideration and examination will ultimately establish whether something exists or not. As a child, you were told over and over and over.
Did you know you are an animal? You're a human animal, and you've got auditus, olfactus, gustus, visus, and tactus. But don't worry about it, because in English that means the five senses. You know what they are? I'll show you. Hearing, smelling, taste, sight. Let's see now. There's one more. Oh yeah, touch. There you are.
You're not like anyone I've ever met before, Barney.
Oh.
This sure is a beautiful day to make new friends.
Patty, if you can't see, how do you know it's a beautiful day?
I just used some of my other senses besides seeing. I can feel the warm sun on my face and the cool breeze when it hits me. And I can smell the spring flowers, and I can hear the leaves rustle in the trees and the birds singing, just like you do.
Well, I never thought of that.
Hey, I'm studying about the five senses right now, and I can show you all about them in the classroom.
I like my head, how about you? It lets me know I'm alive. How many things can you do with your head? I could surely do at least 5.
With our eyes, we
See,
with our ears, we
hear,
with our fingers, we can
touch,
with our nose, we
smell,
with our mouth, we
taste.
Hi, Human Perception and the Five Sense Fallacy. My name is Naeem. My website is www.thefeedbackloop.info. Just want to start off this presentation with a little passage from The Conscious Universe by Dean Radin. Is this for real? The discussions of the reality of psi phenomenon, especially from the scientific perspective, one question always hovers in the background. You mean this is for real? In the midst of all the nonsense and excessive silliness proclaimed in the name of psychic phenomenon, the misinformed use of the term parapsychology by self-proclaimed paranormal investigators, the perennial laughingstock of magicians and conjurers, this is for real? The short answer is yes. A more elaborate answer is, psi has been shown to exist in thousands of experiments. There are disagreements over how to interpret the evidence, but the fact is virtually all scientists who have studied the evidence, including the hard-nosed skeptics, now agree that something interesting is going on that merits serious scientific attention. Later, we'll discuss why very few scientists and science journals are aware of this dramatic shift in informed opinion. That was Dean Radin in the opening of The Conscious Universe, which is a book on the scientific truth of psychic phenomenon. This presentation, the underlying tapestry, is built off of a speech that was presented by a man named Ingo Swann. I'll touch on that a bit later. The contents of this presentation that we'll be covering is the current situation of the early rejection of psi phenomenon. Why is it that these types of phenomenon are laughed at and pushed to the side and not taken seriously in most cases? And we're going to talk about some of the different contributing factors that have brought us to this point. We're going to have talk a little bit about skeptics and scoffers and the difference between the two. And it will become evident that most people who look at this information and the evidence are more on the scoffer side and aren't actually practicing a healthy skepticism, which is important in science. We're going to talk about pre-modern concepts of perception. What did people in the past think about this type of idea? We're going to talk about some new biophysical discoveries, not so new anymore, but they've been mostly ignored and pushed to the side, kept from public attention, which contributes to a biophysical basis for psi phenomenon, which is very interesting. Some of the new fields which have become prevalent in science due to the new biophysical discoveries, some of the sensors and receivers that they discovered within the body. Then we're going to talk about the Ganzfeld effect, which is incorporated into a repeatable, stable effect experiment that is used to offer evidence for psi phenomenon. So let's jump right into it. Ingo Swann. Since 1970, Ingo Swann has worked with over 38 cutting-edge researchers in the fields of parapsychology and cognitive perception, with an additional 14 projects governed by non-disclosure agreements. His early 1970 to 1972 work with parapsychology researchers based in New York produced results that attracted international attention and acclaim. By 1973, with thousands of experimental trials counted up, he was broadly noted as parapsychology's most tested guinea pig. However, he is best known for his long-term association with Dr. Hal Puthoff at Stanford Research Institute. This work, in the field of remote viewing, achieved high luminosity because of sponsorship by U.S. intelligence and military agencies. Through these years, hundreds of thousands of experimental trials contributed to an increase of knowledge that had not been attained elsewhere. Ingo Swann is a renowned researcher of psi and the fuller extent of human perceptions, abilities, and powers. He passed away in 2013. He's a notable artist. His paintings are in the Smithsonian and many popular galleries in the United States. I just wanted to touch on him because the main bulk of this presentation is based off of a speech that Ingo gave, which is titled "The Ongoing Scientific Discovery of Sensory Receptors Which Account for Many Subtle Perceptions." And this is a synopsis of a paper presented on the 21st of March back in 1994 at the United Nations on behalf of the Society for Enlightenment and Transformation. So Ingo Swann, most of the information that I'm presenting here is taken from this speech, which is a synopsis of a paper that Ingo presented at the UN to the Society for Enlightenment and Transformation. I have a link to the original document if you want to check that out in full. So let's go. Here we're going to talk about some of the contributing factors to the current situation, which is the rejection of psi phenomenon, the rejection of psychic, ESP, anything outside of the normal five senses. Why do we reject these type of phenomenon? Well, Ingo puts forth three main points here. First, during the modern past, the real existence of psi faculties was rejected within science, psychology, and psychiatry. The rejection was based on a number of factors which seemed rational and logical in the scientific past, and thus achieved wide acceptance in scientific, academic, and media mainstreams of the 20th century. Second, those factors which seem rational and logical in the past have now been superseded by significant scientific discoveries and advances which substantiate the real existence of at least certain psi faculties. Some of these discoveries are now 50 years old. Keep in mind, Ingo gave this presentation in 1994. These new discoveries absolutely require a swift and large-scale reevaluation, not only regarding psi faculties in particular, but with regard to the larger scope and subtle functions and transformation of human consciousness. Third, however, in spite of the notable scientific advances which affirm the real existence of psi faculties, this necessary and advisable reevaluation is not underway in the three important mainstreams, and which mainstreams continue to support, adhere to, and proliferate the now outdated concepts which, in a broad cultural sense, permitted the past absolute rejection of psi faculties. So he's basically saying here that in the past, science had a bunch of assumptions which everyone agreed with. Soon after, scientific discoveries came which superseded those assumptions, which should mean that a reevaluation should have occurred in relation to those discoveries, but for some reason that hasn't really been happening in the mainstream. It's still being avoided because of the outdated concepts that are still being proliferated and taught in classes in schools. And this has led to this poisonous mentality when it comes to psi phenomenon, ESP, intuition, which has led to some of the greatest scoffers and skeptics in history. I put a couple pictures here, as you know, the not so amazing Randy and some of his friends here who are popular, very popular skeptics who are always quick to debunk anything psi. A lot of people believe that the skepticism in the scientific community is one that is healthy, and that if psi phenomenon were real and true, all scientists would have already came forth and accepted this if the evidence was so strong. But in reality, this is not the truth. The skepticism is an unhealthy skepticism, and as Ingo pointed out in the last few points, that even though scientific discoveries have been made, opinions have not changed, and this is mostly because of those same assumptions that were made in the past. And we're going to touch on some of those soon, but I just wanted to play this little video clip. It's a conversation on skeptics and scoffers, and this is between Stanley Krippner, who is a professor of psychology at Saybrook University. He's well decorated and prominent in his field. He's taken part in many famous experiments in the field of parapsychology. And Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove, he's a clinical psychologist. He is a radio and television interviewer. He has a popular interview series called Thinking Aloud, and also there's a new Thinking Aloud now available on YouTube. I'm going to play a short clip from New Thinking Aloud with a conversation between these two, just to give you an idea of the level of unprofessional scoffing that goes on in science, because a lot of people have the misconception that this is an open-minded endeavor when it comes to researching psi phenomenon, which is not the case with most so-called professionals in these fields. So let's get into this little clip here.
On the other hand, a lot of parapsychologists, and I'll have to put myself into this category, I tend to think that most people who profess to be skeptics are debunkers. They're not real skeptics in a true philosophical sense at all to me. They seem to have their minds made up in advance that everything associated with parapsychology has to be incorrect.
Yeah, first of all, I think the word skeptic is a very honorable word. I think that all of us in parapsychology are, or at least should be, skeptics. Also, I think debunker is an honorable word. In politics, there's a role for debunking.
Mm-hmm.
I think a better word is scoffers. Scoffers are people who are not very serious, who have a knee-jerk reaction to something they don't like. So I prefer to call these people scoffers. Over the years, once I started the work in dream telepathy at Maimonides Medical Center, of course I ran into a lot of scoffers, a lot of criticism of the work, almost all of it unfounded. There were incredible charges that we showed people the pictures before we sent them to the dreamer, that we cheated and did the statistics wrong. Well, all the statistics were done by people outside of the laboratory. Just one error after another that I pulled together in a chapter for a book, Mental Imagery to Arms, edited by Jane Gockenbach, which was about unusual dream phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
So, over the years, I have had a number of, shall we say, unprofessional insults from scoffers. Victor Stegner, the famous physicist, called me a charlatan in an interview. And somebody said, a charlatan? Oh yes, Krippner's the biggest charlatan of them all, which I took as sort of an honor. And then C.E.M. Hansel, a British psychologist, in his book, which debunked parapsychology, said that the people had been shown the picture before the telepathy started, which was a complete fabrication.
You bring them into the dream laboratory, show them the picture, and say, we want to see if you're going to have a dream about this picture.
Can you imagine? Yes. And that misstatement still exists on Wikipedia to this day. It has taken on a life of its own. Yes.
Obviously, it's to create the image of you as a parapsychologist of being a complete idiot.
Absolutely.
So as you can see, even at the professional level, there is still scoffing and unfounded claims being made against the data that's reported from parapsychology experiments that support psi phenomenon. And this is due to the ingrained belief and closed-mindedness that these phenomena are impossible. or must be some kind of trickery or fraud. So let's jump back into some of the reasons why we have this mind state. How did this develop? In modern scientific terms, the major thrust of the rejection was early consolidated within the concepts of philosophical materialism, which came to govern early modern scientific overviews and expectations. As a philosophical commitment, then, the early modern sciences held that whatever constituted scientific reality had to have a physical basis in matter, in the material. And so the consolidation of the rejection of psi was straightforward and simple, that psi could not be accepted until a quantifiable material physical basis for it, or any part of it, was identified. As a general result, the existence of additional senses was denied, both scientifically and philosophically, and it was this denial which resulted in the five senses only theory, which was pervasively proliferated throughout modern societies. This scientific principle, for it indeed functioned as one, thus served as the rationale and logic for the rejection of psi faculties. No physical receptors for those faculties were expected to be scientifically discovered, so the ongoing rejection of psi faculties was considered justified. So these guys are based in philosophical materialism, which most of us are these days. Our main belief systems are based in materialism. If it doesn't have a material basis, we tend to reject it. And these scientists of the old times were saying, hey, there's no physical basis for this stuff, so it ain't real. Case closed. We're not even looking. Information derived from other than the physical five senses was thought to be impossible, at least in theory, and it was upon this theory that psychic information, so-called, was scientifically rejected. Indeed, many leading scientists between 1845 and about 1960 let it be known that there was only one scientific demand which would never be fulfilled, which was the discovery of biophysical receptors which could account for psychic information. So scientific brotherhoods united around the conviction that until physical receptors for psychic information were discovered, then the information should be considered as illusory or psychopathological in origin. Early psychical researchers and later parapsychologists, of course, protested this rejection based solely on this one demand of science. They indicated that if psi faculties were purely psychological in origin and nature, then there would be no biophysical receptors to be found. However, by the same turnaround of the scientific argument against the real existence of psi, should physical receptors for accessing psychic information be discovered, then science proper would be obligated to accept that its one demand was fulfilled. So what happened here is basically the materialist scientists said, hey, there's no physical receptors for these things, and the one demand in science that will never be met is you're never going to find these things. You're never going to find the receptors, so they don't exist. Parapsychologists and psychical researchers, on the other hand, said, hey, if it's all psychological, then no, there will be no receptors to be found. But if we do find these receptors and physical receptors in the body that could account for psychic information, scientists would be obligated, science in general would be obligated to look at this information again. So let's look at some pre-modern concepts of perception. Anthropologists have established that in general, pre-modern societies did not think in terms of having senses, as we might put it today in our computer lingo. They thought more in terms of accessing information or knowledge and achieving perception appropriate to them. The conversation of the concept of accessing information to the concept of having senses appears to have occurred only after the European Renaissance period. So before the European Renaissance, people weren't saying, hey, I got these senses and I'm using my senses to get information. They thought of it more as just accessing information. They were accessing information and achieving perception that was appropriate to them. Thus, the concept that we are dependent on our physical senses rather than dependent on accessing information dates from after the 17th century, while the concept of accessing information is at least 6,000 years old. In this light, the idea that we access information via only our five senses is the modern idea. So people think that, having 5 senses alone is the ancient belief system, that everyone's always believed we only had 5 senses, but that's not true. That's only a modern conception. That's a modern thing that we believe now, that we rely only on our physical 5 senses. The concept that we are completely limited to what we perceive by the physical 5 dates from only about 1845, and was from the outset solely a scientific hypothesis which has never been demonstrated by conclusive scientific fact. Now take that in. Everyone's running around believing that we only have 5 senses, yet this claim has never even been proven by scientific fact. It's just an assumption. A modern assumption, which only dates from about 1845. So let's move on here. A biophysical basis for psi? Here matters rested until the first electron microscope was developed in Germany in 1932, and later evolved in the United States and Canada. After World War II, cellular biology underwent a great jump in importance because of the electron microscope and even more penetrating and precise later technical advances. Now began the slow process of comprehending that biological cells were not the simplistic things once thought. Rather, they were composed of ultra-minute factors which functioned in very remarkable ways. The fact that biological organisms have some kind of electromagnetic substrate was first discovered about 300 years ago, but this substrate was considered weak and unimportant in the face of the chemical substrate, which was thought to be very strong. During the 1930s, however, researchers in various parts of the world, and especially in the former Soviet Union, began to realize that although the electromagnetic substrate was weak, it nonetheless played very important roles within the biochemical whole of all biological organisms. So we have a philosophical materialist dogma, which believed that cells were very simple, the body was very simple. Once the electron microscope came around, they're taking a closer look at these things and they're saying, damn, these things are actually very complex. And not only are they very complex, but they have some kind of energy field around them, an electromagnetic substrate, which is weak when you measure it, but it plays a very important role within all living things. So all living organisms have this non-material substrate field around them. So this is a big change. This is a big discovery. With the invention of the electron microscope in the early 1930s, large amounts of data had accumulated by the 1950s which irrevocably sustain that the human being possessed very many more senses than only the infamous physical 5. As of the late 1950s then, there was no longer any justifiable reason to continue teaching and emphasizing the physical 5 senses. And as well, there was no longer any justifiable reason to continue the mainstream debunking of so-called psychic perceptions, because bio-mind receptors have been located and confirmed for a lot of them. So these guys looked in their electron microscope, saw a bunch of things that they didn't expect to see. They found little receptors and electromagnetic substrates and receivers and receptors that they didn't think existed, but which constitute a basis for psi. So they realized that the human being has way more senses than just 5. But for some reason, and we can speculate on that, if you follow my Powerology series, I believe it has a lot to do with controlling us. But since the 1950s, there was no longer any reason to keep teaching the 5 senses. But here we are in 2016, and I can guarantee you that there are some kids in school right now still being fed this concept. So let's touch on some of these new discoveries that they made. So far, the new discoveries regarding the biological basis for psi faculties roughly fall into 5 categories. The 5 categories are minute chemical receptors and sensors, minute chemical electroreceptors and sensors, neural network exchanges of information in the bio-internal body substrates, bioelectromagnetic information receptors and sensors, bioinformation transfer networks at the atomic, molecular, and neurological levels. Now, if these terms are somewhat confusing, don't worry too much. They simply mean that we are far beyond the five senses only fallacy, and that our bio-mind bodies have multitudes of exceptional senses by way of delicate systems of receptors and sensors at the cellular, nervous, chemical, and bioelectromagnetic levels and their interfaces. A nice way to conceive the whole of this is to comprehend that every cell, possibly every atom in our biophysicality, is a receptor or sensor of some kind. So in other words, we are walking, talking, eating, defecating arrays of exquisitely elegant and sophisticated receptors and sensors. And all of these receptors and sensors are busy accessing information and knowledge, if what is accessed can be organized into recognizable thinking patterns. So these guys found a whole bunch of minute chemical receptors and energetic receptors, bioelectromagnetic receptors and sensors, which pretty much change our whole perspective on what the human body is and how it can relate to the mind and how we access information. Now, ever since these discoveries were made, especially now in modern times, we start hearing more of these terms popping up. A lot of these subjects in science are getting more and more popular, although they're not connected, at least in the public's mind, to psi phenomenon. To give you a broad idea of some of the cutting-edge, largely technical disciplines involved with these new mechanisms of the body: electrochemical physiology, neurobiology, neuropsychology, bioradiation studies, hormone and hormonal transmission research, clinical signal research, bioelectric research, brainwave research, which is very popular, biosensitivity research, bioelectric information transfer research, sensory coding research, biomagnetic navigation research, bioelectronic systems research, and so on and so on. Pheromone and pheromone transfer research, neuromagnetic response research. The authors of these papers, and you can find papers on all these subjects in peer-reviewed studies, experiments, and popular books out today, but the authors of these papers, though, never use the term psi, psychic, or parapsychology, since the mere introduction of them would cause their papers to be rejected. The editors and peer review systems of such publications apparently don't realize, for example, that bioinformation transfer over distance means about the same thing as telepathy and or clairvoyance or remote viewing. So the scientific community has brought in this information and these discoveries without relating it to psi or parapsychology. They've kind of used linguistics and language to talk about this in another way, bioelectric information transfer. They're using more technical scientific terms and not connecting this with the psychic or psi functions. From Deciphering the Senses, The Expanding World of Human Perception, is a 1984 book by Robert Rivlin and Karen Gravel, in which they talk about some of these discoveries that were made. For centuries, we have used an oversimplified and inaccurate model to explain the human senses. Even now, high school biology classes still teach the five senses, but recent scientific research has discovered that there are many more than five senses, and these discoveries have radically changed our understanding of what the senses are and how they work. Rivlin and Gravel redefine for the general reader the spectrum of human perception from the normal to the newly discovered to the extrasensory. And here's what Ingo had to say about the writings in this book. Now, lest there be some misunderstanding here, the two authors are not describing psychological or mental functions. They are discussing the actual existence within our biology of minute physical, chemical, bioelectromagnetic receptors and sensors that interact with networks of the information processing resources of the organism. It is quite easy to ascertain that five senses are obviously not enough to account for the huge range of sensory possibilities for which the human species is capable, while 17 senses is probably more accurate count, with more probably yet to be discovered. No one can survive very well on just five senses. Just ask any seafarer, mountain climber, football or basketball player, explorer or inventor, martial arts expert, or even someone seeking sex. The moment automatic reflexes or intuitive stuff enters into their talk, now you know you have departed from the realm of the physical five and entered into the realms of additional senses. So a lot of the things we take for granted have to do with these minute sensors, our other senses. We come to conclusions and we kind of just think that, oh, we're just smart. We just figure these things out. But the truth is we're accessing information on many levels, and this information trickles up into the processing resources and networks of the brain. And if it can be organized into recognizable thought patterns, we are able to express this information. So let's take a look at some of the receptors that have been located and discovered, which account for what we would call psychic perceptions, but they do actually have a bioorganic basis. So they do have a basis in physical material, in our bodies. Receptors in the nose sensing systems that smell emotions and that can identify motives, sexual receptivity, antagonism, benevolence, etc. Receptors in the ear systems that can detect and identify differences in pressure and electromagnetic frequencies. Skin receptors that detect balance and imbalance regarding what is external to the biobody, even external at some astonishing distances. Directional finding and locating receptors in the endocrine and neuropeptide systems. Whole body receptors, including hair, that identify fluidic motions of horizontal, vertical, diagonal, even if not visibly perceived. For example, the psychic portion of the martial art Aikido. Skin receptors that recognize the temperament of other biological organisms, a format of psi reading. Subliminal sensory systems which locate and identify pitch of sound, a sense of heat across great distances, a sense of frequencies and waves, either mechanical or energetic. Bioelectronic receptors for sensing radiation, including X-rays, cosmic rays, infrared radiation, and ultraviolet light. All of these receptors being found in the retina of the eye. Receptors that respond to exterior electrical fields and systems. And people for many years have talked about seeing auras. People see energetic aura. We've measured this, but these are the receptors that would allow someone to perceive these things. Receptors that trigger alarm and apprehension before their sources are directly perceived. This is a form of psychic foresight or intuition, feeling something happen before it occurs. There's many experiments that show that the body is reacting to things before they even happen. Sensing systems for regarding and identifying nonverbal emotional waves. The following are known to be associated with the pineal gland. If it is healthy and in good working order, it can act as a non-visual photoreceptor, the equivalent of X-ray vision. A lot of people like to talk about the pineal gland. It's thrown around a lot, but not a lot of people talking about its actual uses. And, everyone wants to decalcify it and clean it and activate it, but no one believes in psi anyway, so what's the point, right? Okay, Dean Radin, chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, also known as IONS. He's held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He's well decorated. He's an author and co-author of over 250 technical and popular articles, 36 book chapters, and 3 books, including the award-winning The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, and Supernormal. You should check out his work, definitely. I'm introducing him here because I'm going to play a little video clip of Dean Radin talking about some of the experiments that show evidence for psi. And one of them, a very repeatable and stable experiment with a stable effect above chance, is the Ganzfeld effect. In the 1930s, research by psychologist Wolfgang Metzger established that when people gazed into a featureless field of vision, they consistently hallucinated, and their electroencephalograms changed. Their brainwaves changed. This was called the Ganzfeld effect. Ganzfeld in German means total field, referring to the total field of vision being featureless in Metzger's experiment. So they cut ping pong balls in half, put them over a participant's eyes, and play white noise over earphones and shine a red light. This causes their visual field to be featureless. And they found that if you leave someone in this type of sensory deprivation long enough, they begin to hallucinate. They begin to see things. So parapsychologists and people investigating psychic phenomenon have used this effect in an experiment, which is called the Ganzfeld experiment. So here's Dean Radin talking about the Ganzfeld effect, some of the repetitions of the experiment, and he gives an analysis and meta-analysis of all the studies that have been done on the experiments, and shows that this is a very strong effect, and even the skeptics who have repeated the experiment have scored above chance in their repetitions. So let's get into this.
Because just because people have these experiences doesn't necessarily mean that they're real. Because as we know, the brain is tricking us all the time. There are things that are illusions and coincidences. So how do we get beyond that and see what's really going on? There are a number of methods that have been used. Probably the most famous one that's been repeated many, many times is called the Ganzfeld method. It involves a sender and a receiver who are isolated by shielding or by distance or by both. And the game is that you want the sender to send something mentally to the receiver and then judge whether or not they worked. So the Ganzfeld technique, Ganzfeld is a German word meaning whole field. You shine a red light in the face of the receiver. And then you take a ping pong ball and you cut it in half. You put half of a ping pong ball over each eye. And then you take headphones playing white noise and they wear the headphones. So the receiver is asked to remain awake, but everywhere they look they only see pink, and everything that they can hear is only a hissing sound. So what this does is within about 10 minutes, most people will begin to get hypnagogic imagery. It's because your brain is thinking, I'm awake, I should be seeing or hearing something, but there's nothing there, it's just unpatterned. And so you begin to basically hallucinate, but in a waking state. So it's very easy for imagery to arise. And this is done intentionally because we want the receiver to be in a state of waiting for some sort of stimulus to appear. The stimulus in this case is coming from the sender's thoughts. So the sender's trying to do that. Around the back of the building and when inside, at that point, you would see our electromagnetically shielded room. This is almost 3,000 pounds of solid steel, double-walled, grounded box. So when you go in the room and the door is sealed, there's no external electromagnetics that come in that are above 10 kilohertz. So very long radio waves are blocked, but 10 kilohertz and below are extremely low frequency waves, and nothing blocks that other than about a mile of seawater. So we haven't done that experiment yet, but colleagues have used seawater. So in here, at least we know that any conventional means of signaling is not possible. In the box, we have a lady named Gail who's having the ping pong balls put on her face. So here's what we hope happens, that you want the sender to send something mentally to the receiver. You can't simply ask somebody to mentally come up with something and try to send it, because if the two people knew each other, then they have shared memory. And the likelihood is that if the sender thinks of something, there's a greater than zero chance that the receiver will think of it just because they happen to know who's sending. So instead what you do is we prepare pools of targets beforehand, and then we randomly select a pool. We randomly select one of the targets within the pool. If the experiment works, then the receiver might get an image of an elephant in this case, or maybe just an animal that's gray, and then we record anything that they say. Because when you're in this Ganzfeld state, it's very difficult to remain analytic. So you're likely to forget what you said in the same way that you might forget what a dream was. So here's an example. The receiver is then taken out of the Ganzfeld condition after the sender is trying to send them something for about 20 minutes. Play back anything they said. They might say an animal is gray. And then they look at 4 pictures, one of which is the real target, and then 3 decoys. And the game is basically a 1 in 4 game. So that by chance, the receiver would guess the right target 1 in 4 times. So here's the session that we did with Gail. These are the 4 images that were chosen beforehand to be as different from each other as we could manage. One of the 4 was selected by the toss of a die to be the target. So here's what Gail said. Something has a rough texture. By the way, this is around 80% of everything that Gail said in the course of 20 minutes. Something has a rough texture, tall, looking up high, like in an art gallery or a museum. A Yosemite kind of image of a tall rock, monolithic. Gail, by the way, afterwards said that she didn't know what the word monolithic meant, but she knew that that word had something to do with the target. images of Mount Rushmore and Half Dome like a Big Stone. So if you were a judge in this one session, which of the 4 targets do you think that the sender was sending?
The pyramid?
This is what was being sent. The skeptic would say, well, that's one example maybe selected out of thousands, and the other ones didn't work. So what happens when you have independent people try to repeat these things? So these experiments, very similar to this, or the same experiment, has been investigated since about the 1920s up to the present. Lots of different universities around the world. When you look specifically at the Ganzfeld experiment and how many times it's been replicated, it's 122 experiments by 20 labs and over 4,600 sessions, of which the one you saw with Gail was 1 session. So multiply that by 4,600. The chance hit rate you see is 25%, and each one of these little dots with the error bars is showing the result of each one of the 122 experiments. So you kind of, at a glance, your eye can tell you that it looks like many of them worked, some of them didn't work so good. So this is why meta-analysis has become so popular, because you can't always tell for a weak effect that something is actually real. So we'll now look at this in a cumulative fashion, and you can see much more clearly that we're not regressing to the mean of chance 25%, but we're actually going to 32%. You do the statistics on the likelihood of being at 32%, where chance is 25%. The answer is odds against chance of 300 trillion quadrillion to 1, or 10 to the minus 30th. So this has been discussed many times in one of the top academic psychology journals, Psychological Bulletin. And so if any academic psychologist says that there's no evidence for any kind of psychic phenomena, it means that they're not reading their own journals. Well, the other thing I want to say here is that about the past 2 decades, when you look at the effect that's being reported, and these, by the way, are unselected subjects. These are mostly college sophomores who are doing the test to get credit. So the fact that we have a stable effect over the last 20 years is interesting, because a skeptic would say, well, maybe all of these were done badly, or it's the fluke, or something like that. You should regress down to the mean, down to chance, eventually. But we're not. We're becoming stable at 32%. If we had selected out people who claim to be telepathic, or family members, or identical twins, and people who face validity would suggest have this ability, and that you can do in this database, then we're talking not 32%, but more like 50 to 60%. Much better results in this type of experiment. But because this is mostly composed of ordinary people, it suggests that we're dealing with a human ability, which is mostly unconscious. It's there, you can evoke it in the laboratory to a small extent, but it's a real effect. So it seems reasonably certain that something like telepathy exists. Then the skeptic could say, well, maybe these are not really well-designed experiments. Or maybe people aren't reporting all of the experiments, just they're reporting the good ones and they leave the other ones aside. So these are alternative explanations, some of which are built into the design and other ones are evaluated afterwards. They include things like, could there have been some kind of leakage about the target from one person to the other? Or recording mistakes, or on and on, selective reporting, fraud on the part of the experimenters, or fraud on the part of the subjects. But the bottom line always is, what happens if you have somebody who does not believe in telepathy or any kind of psychic experience at all, but does this experiment? What does a skeptic get? Well, we had no answer to that until 2005, because skeptics don't do experiments. They just complain about them. So we have 2 professors who, in their article, explicitly say they don't believe in any kind of psychic powers. But to their credit, they went ahead and did the Ganzfeld experiment, and they said after 8 studies, they had an overall statistically significant hit rate of 32%, which is what we've been seeing for 40 years now. But because of their initial position, they added that this was precariously close to demonstrating humans do have psychic powers, and so we don't even believe our own results. The strength of the evidence is sufficient at this point to convince even prominent lifelong skeptics, including this psychology professor in the UK, a prominent skeptic, who has said in a magazine interview or a newspaper interview, I think that these studies do meet the usual standards for a normal claim. That means that If telepathy was not controversial, then the data would be overwhelming. This would not be, that people would simply accept it. But because telepathy is controversial, even Richard Wiseman doesn't accept the data. What it tells us is that his a priori probability that telepathy could exist is extremely low. It's down in the 10 to the minus 20th range. At some point, skepticism is, of course, necessary in science, but if your a priori probabilities are so low that you don't accept the possibility of something, it's not even science anymore.
It's a stable effect, a well above chance, which is evidence for some type of information being passed, not using the five senses. The five sense only theory would not explain this. And he also goes on to say that if psychologists say there's no evidence for psychic phenomenon, they haven't been reading the literature, which ties back to the skepticism and scoffing that was mentioned earlier. Most of the people in these fields aren't even reading their own journals and literature to stay up to date because they have this dogma that this can't be true. So the results are in. During the 1960s and 1970s, the scientific information pool of this kind of discovery had increased enormously, the sum of which brought a complete end to the concept of the five physical senses only. A complete end, at least, in a scientific sense, but not in a cultural sense, because the meaning of these sensory discoveries is still being completely ignored in the cultural and ideological milieus, even though technical and popular books became available. Today, there is no justification at all for the continuation of anti-psychic belief systems. There is no justification to teach that we have only five physical senses, and that there is every justification to teach that we have very many others. There is also no justification to continue suggesting that there is a difference between sensory and extrasensory perceptions and information. The discoveries regarding our numerous senses and sensing systems obliterated the boundaries which, in the uninformed past, tended to artificially separate them. Instead, we need to think more basically in terms of information. It is information that is important, regardless of the manner in which it is acquired or via which sensory system are utilized to do so. If we think only in terms of senses and or sensing systems, then in very subtle ways we may be distinguishing between them and ourselves. It is true that we do have or possess senses and sensing systems, but something else is also true and is very important that it should be grasped. We are our sensing systems, and what we call we or us or self is in some full part neither no more nor no less than our sensing systems are acknowledged, developed, and utilized. Since we are our sensing systems, the full nature and realization of them must in some direct sense be completely meaningful to the overall goals of this important society for enlightenment and transformation. So Engel's saying here in conclusion that we keep trying to differentiate between our sensing systems and ourselves, but we are our sensing systems, and only if we come to acknowledge and develop and utilize these, that's only as far as we're going to know about ourselves. So it comes back to the whole knowledge of self, and it's one of the reasons why this is ignored. People in control of society and the minds of humans in general don't want you to know that you have the ability to access information. They want to keep you on a physical 5 level where they can feed you information only through certain channels. So I hope you learned something from this presentation. I hope I sparked your interest. Here's a slide with some related literatures. Some of the books were mentioned in the presentation. Most of these can be found on Amazon, and some can even be found in your local bookstores. Conscious Universe by Dean Radin has many analysis and meta-analysis of the dozens of experiments that show scientific proof for psychic phenomenon. Anomalous Cognition by C. May and Marwa, which is on remote viewing research and theory. The Reality of ESP by Russell Targ, which is a great book. A Physicist's Proof of Psychic Abilities. Mind Reach, Scientists Look at Psychic Abilities, which is a classic by Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, which goes over some of the early remote viewing experiments done at Stanford Research Institute. Rupert Sheldrake, Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery. The Body Electric by Becker, talking about electromagnetism and the foundations of life, which relates to what we were speaking about earlier in the presentation with the electromagnetic substrate that's found on living organisms. Deciphering the Senses by Robert Rivlin and Karen Gravel. Some of the information was mentioned in this presentation. Sensation and Perception by Schiffman as well, which some of the information was featured within this presentation. So, yeah, get some readings in. I hope that this sparked your interest in this topic. Knowledge of self is the most important knowledge that we should be pursuing in the time of deception that we are in today. So, till next time, peace and love, y'all.